Welcome to the Devil in the Details podcast with your host, Will Nesbitt.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Devil in the Details podcast, the podcast where I investigate and expose ongoing, unlawful, non-consensual human experimentation on innocent men and women in the U.S. and possibly abroad. I am one of those people victimized by this atrocity, and now I am working hard to restore justice by sharing evidence and information in hopes of prompting a proper investigation. Join me in my fight and help raise awareness by tuning in and sharing this podcast with your family and friends. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Devil in the Details podcast. I am your host, Will Nesbitt. Thank you for joining me today. Let's get into it. So, today is the fourth and final part of a series where I have read and analyzed the law article, When Human Experimentation is Criminal, written by L. Song Richardson. It's a wonderful and powerful article that allows us to take a look from a legal standpoint of what happens when researchers and doctors, universities, and government agencies are not held accountable for medical wrongdoing and for abusing innocent people, all in the name of quote unquote progress, medical progress and advancements. So join me as we finish out this series, and be sure to stay tuned to find out what else I have planned for you on the podcast. And so without further delay, let's go ahead and get into it. Part 4, the utility of desert. Criminal punishment expresses moral condemnation in a way that alternative sanctions do not. This part argues that imposing criminal punishment will also further instrumentalist goals such as deterrence and moral education as a happy consequence. Part A, deterrence. Punishment can deter vindicating the value of the victim through protection. This protective function works by issuing a sting that the offender feels upon engaging in a prohibited act. The desire to avoid this pain in the future is how deterrence is achieved. Determining how best to deter misconduct in human subject research is important because the protection of human subject autonomy essentially falls upon the individual researcher. In theory, institutional bodies such as the FDA, NIH, and institutional review boards police misconduct by approving research protocols and conducting periodic audits. In practice, resource constraints make any consistent effort to ensure that human subjects are protected illusory. Since these institutions cannot audit even a small subset of human subject research, they rely upon researchers to provide truthful information in the study protocol when seeking approval to conduct research, to comply with follow-up reporting requirements, and to follow informed consent requirements. Thus, the lack of consistent and reliable institutional oversight of human subject research fails to provide adequate deterrence incentives. Researchers are essentially left to police themselves, and historically they have failed in their efforts. It took a law student to bring an end to the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, the FDA to stop Dr. Kligman's experiments at Holmesburg Prison, the suspicions of a patient and his lawyer to discover Dr. Gold's mining of Moore's body, and a death to expose the actions of Dr. Wilson. These are only a few instances of ineffective self-policing. Another example is the recent discovery that for over 60 years, researchers at the State University of Iowa, now Iowa University, concealed experiments performed on unwitting orphans. A professor at the university led experiments on children to test his hypothesis that stuttering was conditioned in children as a result of overly critical parents. With the university's knowledge and agreement, he tested his hypothesis at an orphanage, telling the orphanage that he was conducting a study to improve children's speech. During the course of the experiment, his research assistant very successfully made non-stuttering children into stutterers. After the experiment was over, very little effort was made to correct the stuttering they had induced in the children, and the efforts they did make were largely unsuccessful. Those involved in the study acknowledged that they were engaged in a monster experiment that would, if discovered, be compared to the World War II experiments and ruin the careers of the scientists and researchers involved. Thus, they decided to conceal it. The experiment was discovered in 2001 only after the research assistant suffered an attack of conscience and alerted the press. The threat of criminal punishment would likely have important deterrent effects on researchers. Currently, a researcher engaged in calculated risk-taking knows that if he violates human subject protections, the likelihood of discovery is minimal, and even if discovered, he will not be prosecuted. At most, he may pay compensatory damages or face temporary restrictions on his research. The sting of criminal punishment, including the stigma of being branded a criminal, risk of imprisonment, and message of disapproval, denunciation, and reproach, is more serious than that provided by alternative sanctions. The fear of being labeled a criminal will likely be felt strongly by researchers because they are a class that is prone to view themselves as different from the common criminal. Hence, the consequences of criminal punishment can be expected to deter more effectively than other sanctions, even if the possibility that culpable acts will be discovered remains equally small. A law is only as good as it is enforced. You've heard me say this several times throughout this series, and I'm going to say it again, and I'm going to keep saying it until we all understand what's at stake for ignoring what should be done. What's the purpose of having laws and rules and regulations if you don't use them? Justice does not rest, doesn't take breaks. It is always working, and it is always available. So when we talk about researchers and scientists committing atrocities against innocent people, and for victims and their families to call attention to it and to sue or to seek justice, whether it be criminal punishment or civil, and for the justice system, judges, to ignore that, then that is the very definition of injustice. It is deliberate, it is intentional, and it is wrong. Institutions like the FDA, the NIH, and IRB commit injustice when they fail not only to act, but turn a blind eye to unlawful research practices. These are crimes. And the so-called justice system is complicit when they do not prosecute. Justice is supposed to be fair and consistent. It is supposed to, it seeks to restore balance and right what is wrong. Injustice is always an imbalance. What does the Pledge of Allegiance say? Liberty and justice for all. Liberty and justice for all, regardless of your job title, regardless of your socioeconomic status, rich, poor, black, white, Hispanic, Russian, whatever. It's supposed to apply to everyone. And when that doesn't happen, we will continue to see things like this happening to innocent people. Because the people responsible have not experienced consequences. Researchers, they don't police themselves any more than a criminal organization would police themselves, any more than a gang or a mafia organization or the FBI or the CIA would police themselves. They take all the necessary precautions to protect themselves, yet take little to no thought about the people that they are experimenting on, that they are harming. They do all they can to protect themselves from punishment, yet little to nothing to protect the subject from physical and psychological harm. This is wrong. Let's move on. Part B, moral education. Punishment can also be an effective moral educator. The infliction of pain serves as an educative function because it interferes with the offender's pursuit of his interests, draws his attention to the crime and society's condemnation of it, and conveys to him that certain actions are fenced off in virtue of what we take to be their immoral character. The criminal law's educative and socializing role is arguably necessary to teach researchers that violations of autonomy and dignity are wrong, despite the potential utility of the research. There is evidence that research community norms may serve to facilitate misconduct. First, researchers have been resistant to attempts to place mandatory limits on their research. For example, many researchers objected to the binding nature of the Nuremberg Code as an appropriate guide for their behavior. The code was created in response to the atrocities committed by Nazi doctors during the Second World War and forms the basis for the protection of human subjects in the United States today. It establishes a set of mandatory, explicit, and uniform ethical guidelines and standards to govern the conduct of medical research on humans. Its 10 principles seek to attain two broad goals. First, it aspires to protect autonomy by giving human subjects the absolute right to decide whether to participate in experiments and to end their participation at any time. Second, It aims to protect the welfare of human subjects either by prohibiting certain risky research from being conducted at all, or by requiring researchers to terminate an experiment at any stage if its continuation is likely to result in injury, disability, or death. Researchers rejected the code as a good code for barbarians, but an unnecessary code for ordinary physicians. They thought that the code's legalistic demands were unnecessary and unduly burdensome to research. As a former dean of the Harvard Medical School put it, the Nuremberg Code was conceived in reference to Nazi atrocities and was written for the specific purpose of preventing brutal excesses from being committed and excused in the name of science. The code, however admirable in its intent and however suitable for the purpose for which it was conceived, is, in our opinion, and not necessarily pertinent to or adequate for the conduct of medical research in the United States. Second, the research community appears to resist efforts to effectively investigate allegations of misconduct. For example, after Dr. Kligman's actions at Holmesburg Prison came to light, attempts were made by the American Academy of Dermatology to discover more information about his research at the prison. The Academy created a task force that sent letters to the researchers involved in the experiments asking for comments. The letters referenced the atrocities at Nuremberg. When Academy officers learned of this, they were furious. They not only immediately informed the task force that it had not been authorized to suggest that the experiments may have been in violation of the Nuremberg Code, but they also immediately sent apologies to each researcher who had received the letter. Finally, the research community tends to defend culpable researchers and downplay the harm. For instance, with respect to Dr. Wilson and the death of Jesse Gelsinger, some members of his community stated that the sanctions against him were unwarranted. When the University of Pennsylvania restricted Dr. Wilson's ability to conduct experiments on humans and decided to stop manufacturing genetically altered viruses, a leading scientist in the field said that the university's move was an overreaction. This is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It basically eliminates the gene therapy program if you can't run trials. Another prominent and well-respected professor, ethicist, and director of the gene therapy program at the University of California, San Diego, stated that Jesse's death was at worst another pothole in the road. Comments such as these underscore that research norms are in need of modification, a need that can be well addressed by criminal sanctions. The criminal sanction can shape or even change norms or preferences within a community because people in part learn what is morally blameworthy through what is punished. Let me say that again. People in part learn what is morally blameworthy through what is punished. The sanction teaches people, both potential offenders and the community at large, what the public morality is, whether or not they fully internalize it. Criminal punishment can be used self-consciously to change beliefs, attitudes, and personal values and goals, and can effectuate policy considerations by influencing what a person thinks he ought to do or what he wants to do in a particular situation. Changing social norms can, in turn, influence choices by altering the effects of reputational incentives and consequences for self-conception. If the criminal sanction is successful in shaping social norms, then behaving in a manner inconsistent with them will result in public disapproval, which in turn will produce embarrassment or perhaps shame and a desire to hide. To the extent that idealization bias and social benefit bias affects public views about researcher misconduct, criminal punishment can help rekindle in the public a sense of the immorality of the defendant's acts. Its power to express moral condemnation may more effectively deter misconduct and change both researchers' and society's views concerning bad acts. Criminal punishment can help overcome the idealization bias and social benefit biases that currently appear to exist in the context of human subject experimentation. Part 5. Scrutinizing criminal punishment. There exists little difficulty in distinguishing bad acts from good ones. If mistaken or negligent acts cannot be consistently and accurately distinguished from wrongful ones before imposing punishment, the fear of erroneous identification as a culpable actor may keep well-intentioned actors from engaging in research. Additionally, if the line between good and bad acts in medical research is a fine one, researchers may become excessively cautious in order to avoid wrongful exposure to criminal punishment. The argument against criminal punishment then is that when there exists difficulty distinguishing between acts we want to encourage and those we do not, it is more appropriate to price rather than to prohibit the behavior. The conclusion. The fact that human subject research is socially beneficial should not mean that culpable acts go unpunished. Criminal punishment in appropriate instances would send a clear, expressive message that doctors are not privileged to treat human subjects in a manner inconsistent with their inherent value as human beings. Punishment can reassert acknowledgement of the victim's worth in the face of a denial. Proper punishment will cause suffering in the offender and demonstrate to researchers that their actions are worthy of stigma, ridicule, and shame, and in this way perhaps change the attitudes of the relevant community. This, in turn, will restore the proper balance between protecting human dignity and autonomy and allowing socially beneficial research to continue. It will also likely make the self-policing nature of the existing regulations more effective. Punishment will help change the existing biases, which can in turn change the existing norms and place the protection of individuals front and center instead of allowing individuals to be used as guinea pigs in favor of broader societal goals. If we are serious about protecting individual autonomy and dignity in research, consideration of criminal punishment is an important step. You never really know what you're capable of until you're put into a certain situation. You never know what you will do or won't do until you're presented with a particular set of circumstances. It's easy to sit back and say, oh man, I would never do XYZ. It's easy to say that. But when you're presented with certain circumstances, you never know what you'll do. Especially when you know that you have a chance at getting away with it. As children, we don't really understand consequences. We're curious and it's innocent. So you may get into things or, play with something you shouldn't be playing with, or getting into some cabinet or drawer that you should not be getting into. Sometimes it's cute, when a child takes, all the hair grease out of their, mother's jar and smears it all over their face, or gets into the toilet and splashes water all around. Those things are cute. But when a child gets into, underneath the sink and gets into the bleach and drinks it, or worse, if they're playing with a gun and that gun is loaded and it goes off, we've seen these things, and these things are not intentional. The child doesn't know. They're curious. And so when they're caught, certain things, depending on what it is, we may make light of it. Nowadays, we record it and post it on social media. And it's lighthearted fun. But you always want to teach the child, no, this is not what you do. You're supposed to handle this particular way, or you don't handle it at all. Sometimes they learn the lesson without having to be told. Put your hand on the stove, you get burned, you'll know not to do that again, because, the consequences were immediate, right? But for other things, you may not understand until, your parents catch you, and now you're getting scolded. Sometimes, back in the day, we got whoopings, we got spankings, for a lot of stuff. But you learn to not do that again. And it's through those punishments that we're taught. Now, sometimes some parents can take the approach where they just talk to the child and say, hey, don't do that. You try to make the child understand, but they're still children, right? So certain things they may not comprehend, because they may figure in their little brain, they may think, well, I'm not hurt. I got yelled at, or, they laughed at it, and, we go on. And so they're likely to do it again. Like when I see certain children, people allowing their children to dance to certain types of music, and it seems innocent and all in good fun at the time. However, you're teaching that child what is acceptable, because those lyrics, even though they may not comprehend them on a certain level, it still seeps in, right? And certain conduct, as they get older, they see becomes acceptable, especially if mom and dad or the people around them are singing, dancing, having a good time to the same music and participating in the same lifestyle. And that's where the child learns it from. So it's not the music, right? It's the people who allow the child to indulge in that, to get away with certain things. When you don't punish them, they're going to keep doing it. You keep laughing at it, you're encouraging it. And the same thing happens with adults. You don't grow out of that. There will come times when you feel like, shoot, this is something I want to do, or this is something I have to do, and I'm going to do it. And I hope I don't get caught, or you're going to take precautions to not get caught. For instance, if, when people get to their lowest point, if you're hungry, you're on the streets, and you have to eat, you have to survive. You need clothes, you need shelter. So the human body, or in the human mind, you're going to do what you need to do to make these things happen. People will steal bread to eat because they're hungry. Now, if they're caught, they're punished, right? Sometimes the punishments are much more severe than they need to be, and we're not going to even talk about the fact that, why are people in this country, which is supposed to be the greatest country on earth, going hungry when we have the means to stop that. But you're going to do it if you can get away with it. You're going to go into that store, you're going to tuck that bread under your shirt, you're going to break into that house, that abandoned home, to sleep. You're going to do what you need to do. Some people commit crimes just so they can go to jail. I was watching this news story or a clip of it. I need to watch the whole thing the other day about, I believe it's Japan, where there are senior citizens who commit crimes on purpose just so they can go to jail. Many are doing this out of loneliness. Some are doing it out of survival because they know they have a place where they'll eat, they'll be able to sleep, they'll be relatively safe, and they won't be alone. That's the extent that human beings will go to take care of our basic needs. Now, when you get into other areas where people commit crimes and there is no pressing need, now we're diving into greed, right? We're talking about the person who's well off, who goes to certain parts of town and panhandles, knowing you have money. You have a nice house, you have a nice car, the car that you drove in to park somewhere and sit on the corner just so you can pretend and lie to people to make them pity you and give you money. And there are people who make a killing doing this. I mean, they really clean up. But that's greed. It's wrong. And unless they are caught and punished, they're going to keep doing it. And you may think, these people, they live in these nice houses and they have nice things. And you may think, oh man, they're, some people may have a problem with it. Some people may not. Either way is wrong. Then you have others who are in the financial careers with the Ponzi schemes. Doctors prescribing drugs, making money off of it, prescribing drugs to people who aren't even sick, making money. You'll notice that whenever these types of people are prosecuted for their crimes, it's usually for something that hurts the government's pocket or image. Those people are always caught. They're always reprimanded, or they're always punished. But when it comes to committing injustices against everyday people, the non-rich, or even against certain minorities, justice is a little lax. So when you have researchers and doctors and universities, and they operate on people, they remove body parts, tissues, inject foreign substances into their bodies just to see what'll happen, or to test some new drug or new medical procedure. And this hurts the person that it's done to. That's a crime. And it's a crime because you try to hide it. You try to hide it. You take every precaution to try to keep that from being public knowledge. And when it is public knowledge, they don't deny it. They just say, well, it's in the best interest of science. Which is, a hot crock of mess. It's unfortunate that we live in a society where people can get away with these types of things. So that need or that curiosity to see what'll happen, some people don't lose that. The researcher is a lot like that child, getting into things, experimenting, curious. But when they cause damage and hurt others, and if they're not punished, and if they're rewarded for it, they're going to keep doing it. Child hits the sibling over the head with a hammer. The other child is hurt. Everybody's laughing about it like, oh, no, don't do that. But, still laughing about it. Child doesn't learn consequences. So what's going to happen? You're going to do it again and maybe worse. Researchers remove someone's heart and replaces it with, whatever, or does something else. Inject someone with radiation. Someone turns them in, they may sue them, or they may take them to, they may be prosecuted in criminal courts, but nothing happens to them, then what's going to happen? They're going to do it again. We must get to a point where we're willing to say no more. And obviously, government agencies and the institutions that are supposed to be watching and regulating these experiments, they're not going to do it. So it's up to the people to let it be known that we won't stand for it. This is something that has been happening in this country and other countries for ages. The experiments that I've touched on this podcast, that is just a drop in the bucket. There are hundreds, possibly even thousands more experiments that we know of. These are the ones that we know of. I hate to think of what we don't know. And very few of those have had any of the researchers punished or even gone to jail. Now, some have been sued and there have been settlements reached. But the thing that these government agencies try to do is they'll give the victims and their families a little bit of compensation for it. But they don't want to go so far as to criminally punish these people, these doctors, because of the stigma that it'll bring. And also because of the possibility that it may discourage researchers from doing their work, from exploring, from stepping outside of the box and discovering new methods and new ways of doing things. But we still must send a message. Hey, you can be innovative. You can do what you need to do. Just don't hurt anybody. And they know this is the case because they're taught this. They're taught this. One of the basic rules that any researcher is taught is basically to get consent for the research or the experiment that you're trying to do. That's the first thing that you're taught. So why not do that? Why not do what is right? The other problem is that a lot of these research projects are kept hush hush. That's another thing, because whenever I present these the experiments that I have touched on, there are most of the people that comment on this and tell me they've watched it. They say, I never knew this. I've never heard of it. And honestly, myself, I've never heard of it until I actually went to seek out that information. It's not common knowledge. It's not common knowledge, and it should be. And that is the goal of this podcast, to call attention to these types of things so that more people know, hey, this is happening, so that more victims are known, their stories are told. And so people will understand, hey, I don't want this to happen to me, to my family, to my children. What can we do? And then that's when we get the ball rolling. That's when we can actually make some real change and not only get justice for victims of the past, but prevent victims in the future and help those in the present. Birds of a feather flock together. As we read here, whenever there have been, or whenever certain agencies have tried to take action, because there have been people and certain organizations within government that have tried their best to do what is right towards victims and to enforce the rules of consent for medical research. There have been people that have tried this. Okay. So I can't say it's all of government. I can't say it's all of the people in these organizations. There have been some people who have tried. But what's interesting to note is that a large number of people in the research community have fought against sanctions against misconduct. You know, whenever these government agencies try to bring down the hammer, you'll see these organizations, a lot of these researchers, especially the more well-known people, have sent letters and raised a fuss to try to get these rules relaxed or certain judgments and punishments overturned. And this is because, possibly because they themselves have things that they don't want found out or punished for, or they have plans to do something. It's like when you see law enforcement organizations, when you have a common police officer who, commits some horrible atrocity, some act of violence, or some sort of fraudulent, thing against a citizen, and you don't hear about other officers, speaking out against these things. At least I don't see it. I don't see officers coming out saying, hey, that was wrong, calling each other out. They if there are so-called good ones out there, that which you hear that a lot, there are some good officers. Okay, well, where are these good people when something goes down, when someone gets shot for something stupid? Where are these people? Why aren't you speaking out? When you see people in the military, when our government is in these other countries, or even doing something here at home, harming people, why don't you see more of their own speaking out against them? Are they not allowed to speak out? Because if you're in an organization and you're not allowed to speak out against what is wrong, then you're in the wrong organization. You have no business being there. Because now you've given up your freedom to be a part of it. It's amazing the lengths that people will go to get and keep this sense of belonging. We rarely like to go against the crowd for fear of being embarrassed or fear of being ostracized. And this is basic human nature. But we exercise and show maturity when we rebel against that internal desire to just stay comfortable, to play it safe. No, I'm not going to say nothing because, I don't want to ruffle any feathers. We all do that. It's the people who stand up and speak out in spite of that fear that still tugs at you. But it's those people who speak out in spite of that. Those are the courageous ones. You say there are good cops and good soldiers out here. Well, what makes them good? Is it because they're not doing what their colleague is doing? Are you good because of what you don't do or because of what you do? I don't drink or smoke or do drugs. Does that make me a good person? No. It just means I don't partake in those things. That's good for me. But, I may have other vices that may make me a terrible person. Are these cops good because, they don't steal and lie and, well, not necessarily lie because most people do lie, but because they're not, stealing money and drugs out of evidence, or because they're not shooting innocent people or harassing people? Maybe. I mean, if they're doing their jobs and they're consistent and fair at all times, then yeah. But when you have your colleague, the person that you work beside, that you work with, that you represent and who represents you, when they step out of line and you don't correct that, are you still good? Remember, justice does not rest. Be not weary in well doing. Justice does not rest. It's always on. So when you have a justice system, a so-called justice system, or legal system, I should say, legal system, that allows these things to happen and does not punish or offer any significant punishments, then they are complicit and they're not good. Doctors and researchers, universities, and government agencies that participate or allow unlawful experiments on innocent people should be criminally punished, in addition to having to compensate victims and their families monetarily. And this information these experiments must be made public. That is the only way we're going to put a stop to this and keep it from happening going forward. And that is my goal. That's what I'm here to do, to make sure that this happens. And it's going to happen. One way or another, it's going to happen. You can't stop it. It's going to happen. So this concludes the fourth and final episode in this series. I want to thank you all for joining me. I want to thank Miss L. Song Richardson for this wonderful document and her thorough analysis, which challenges this system and this practice of unlawful experimentation. And I do have another series that I plan to do after this one, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. I'll be letting you know what it'll be after finish doing some research and kind of put it together. But I think you'll like it, and hopefully you enjoyed this. If you did, please share it with your family and friends and other researchers and law professors, lawyers, judges, whoever. Share it with your family and friends. Have discussions about it. Talk about it. Do your research on these things. Dive in. And as always, if you have any questions or comments or suggestions, please reach out to me. Be sure to check out and sign my petitions and join me on my social media pages. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, or X. Also YouTube and Spotify. You can find the podcast episodes there. You can find everything on my link tree, which is linked here and also in my my bio. Again, I want to say thank you for joining me. I really do appreciate it. Hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. Take care. Peace.